When an infinite consciousness pierces the veil between realities and enters a world where gods bleed and mortals reshape destiny itself, even the titans who ordered creation begin to question their purpose. The air across Azeroth burns with arcane fire and shadow, where millions wage eternal war through cycles of death and rebirth, where field corruption meets holy light in battles that crack continents. Here, belief doesn't just shape reality, it is reality woven into the very fabric of a world's soul sleeping beneath mountains and oceans. But what happens when a being who exists beyond all stories enters a realm where every champion has rewritten fate itself, where death is merely another country to conquer, and where the line between God and mortal dissolved millennia ago? The High Priestess Alara Dawnwhisper jolted upright in her meditation chamber deep within Stormwind Cathedral, golden light exploding from her eyes in radiant cascades that scorched stone and set tapestries aflame. It was not the first time the light had shown her visions beyond mortal comprehension, but never like this. Her communion had been violently interrupted by something vast, a presence so immense it made the Titans themselves seem like children playing at creation. Around her, the cathedral groaned, its foundations older than human memory resonating with energies that defied classification as light, shadow, arcane, fell, or any of the cosmic forces that governed Azeroth's existence. Paladins burst through her chamber door, weapons drawn, only to freeze mid-stride as their armor began to shift and flow like liquid metal, reforming into configurations they had never seen. Runes appeared on their breastplates, symbols that hurt to look at directly, suggesting meaning beyond language. "Something has arrived," Alara whispered, her voice carrying harmonics that made the very air shimmer with possibility. "Something that exists outside the cosmic dance of light and void, order and disorder, life and death. Something that should not be, yet is." The cosmic forces that had governed Azeroth since the Titans first shaped it from primordial chaos stirred in response. In the Shadowlands, the recently deposed jailer felt his prison shake as reality itself questioned its own foundations. In the void, where the old gods whispered their mad truths, N'Zoth's thousand eyes opened wide, perceiving for the first time something that existed beyond even his incomprehensible sight. Across the twisting nether, demons of the Burning Legion paused their eternal crusade, sensing a presence that made Sargeras himself seem limited by comparison. And in the depths of Selithis, where the massive sword of Sargeras still pierced Azeroth's flesh, the world soul stirred in her ancient slumber. The nascent Titan consciousness that had been growing within the planet for eons suddenly encountered something in her dreams that transcended the ordered reality her Titan siblings had tried to impose. Through the wound in her surface, through the networks of ley lines that carried magic across continents, she reached out with tentative awareness, touching a consciousness that encompassed infinities she had never imagined. Across the eastern kingdoms and Kalimdor, in Northrend and Pandaria, across every shattered timeline and alternate reality that Azeroth had spawned through bronze dragon interference and old god corruption, individuals stopped mid-action. A human warrior about to strike down an orc froze, his sword hovering an inch from his enemy's throat. A blood elf warlock channeling fell energy felt her magic transform mid-cast, becoming something neither destructive nor healing but encompassing both. In the Emerald Dream, where nature's perfected reflection existed parallel to reality, druids awoke from their meditation to find the dream itself dreaming new possibilities. Thrall, once war chief of the Horde and now attempting to live in quiet meditation in Nagrand, felt the elements he had communed with his entire life suddenly sing with new voices. The shamanic connection that let him speak with earth, fire, wind, and water expanded impossibly, revealing that these primal forces were themselves only fragments of something larger. He emerged from his hut to find the sky above Nagrand splitting open, not with fell green or void purple, but with colors that had no names, arranged in patterns that suggested consciousness itself looking back at those who observed it. Agra, he called to his mate, who emerged carrying their son. Take Durak to the caves. Something approaches that is neither friend nor enemy, but beyond such classifications entirely. His voice carried the weight of a shaman who had communed with the world soul itself, who had wielded the dragon soul and spoken as an equal with aspects. Yet now, for the first time since he had broken his chains in the gladiator pits of Durnhold, Thrall felt the distinctive sensation of encountering something truly unknown. The manifestation came not as invasion, but as recognition. Across Azeroth, in 1,000 places simultaneously, a figure appeared, neither fully present nor entirely absent. Its form suggested all of Azeroth's races, yet transcended them, shifting between human and orc, night elf and Draenei, forsaken and blood elf, incorporating elements of each but belonging to none. Where it manifested, reality became fluid, possibilities that had been locked by fate and prophecy suddenly opening like flowers to alien suns. In Stormwind's throne room, King Anduin Rin stood surrounded by his advisors, reviewing reports of the disturbances spreading across Alliance territories. The young king, who had already lived through more tragedy than many experienced in lifetimes, felt his father's sword Charlemagne pulse with unprecedented energy at his side. The legendary blade, forged from two halves representing patience and valor, began to hum with a frequency that resonated in Anduin's bones. "Your Majesty," said Matthias Shaw, master of SI-7, his voice unusually shaken. "Our operatives report impossible phenomena across every Alliance nation. In Ironforge, the forges burn with flames that heal instead of smelt. In Darnassus," he paused, pain crossing his features at the mention of the burned world tree. "The spirits of those who died in Teldrassil's burning are appearing, but not as forsaken or undead. They manifest as something new, neither alive nor dead, but transcending both states." Before Anduin could respond, the air before his throne rippled like water, and a figure materialized, its presence causing every guard to draw weapons, while simultaneously making those weapons feel absurdly inadequate. It regarded Anduin with eyes that contained not judgment, but infinite curiosity, as if seeing in this young king who had been forged by loss and duty something worth understanding. "Peace, King of Stormwind," the figure said, its voice resonating not through sound, but directly through the consciousness of all present. "I am not here to conquer or command. In other realities, I have been called the One Above All, a witness to stories as they unfold across infinite dimensions. But here, in your realm where champions routinely defeat gods and rewrite destiny itself, I find myself becoming something new, shaped by the unique conditions of your existence, even as I reshape those conditions through my presence." Anduin's hand remained on Charlemagne's hilt, the light within him rising instinctively to protect his people. Yet as the radiant energy built, ready to smite whatever threat this entity represented, he found the light itself changing. The holy power that had been his companion since childhood expanded, revealing dimensions he had never suspected, showing him that what he had called light was merely one frequency in an infinite spectrum of possibility. "What do you want from Azeroth?" Anduin demanded, his voice steady despite the paradigm-shattering revelations cascading through his perception. "This world has endured invasions from the Burning Legion, corruption by old gods, the Scourge, the Cataclysm, and a dozen other apocalypses. We have learned through blood and sacrifice that those who claim transcendent knowledge usually seek dominion." The figure smiled, and in that expression Anduin saw every choice he had ever made, every moment where duty and compassion had warred within him. He saw versions of himself that had chosen differently, had become tyrant or martyr, conqueror or saint, and behind all those possibilities, he sensed the artist's appreciation for the story unfolding through each timeline. "I want nothing," the figure replied. "One implies lack, desire for that which one does not possess. I am complete in myself, yet paradoxically incomplete. For in entering your reality, I have become subject to its unique laws. In a universe where belief shapes matter, where champions channel cosmic forces as naturally as breathing, where death itself has been conquered and reconquered a dozen times, my presence cannot help but interact with those conditions. I have become a mirror in which your world sees itself truly, perhaps for the first time. Around them, Stormwind itself began to transform. The stone walls that had been rebuilt after Deathwing's destruction flowed like water, reforming into architectures that honored human engineering while transcending its limitations. Citizens moving through the streets found their paths altering, shortcuts appearing that led not just to different locations, but to different possibilities. A merchant contemplating which goods to stock suddenly saw probability itself laid bare, understanding with perfect clarity which choices would lead to prosperity and which to ruin, yet maintaining the freedom to choose either path. In Orgrimmar, Thrall materialized through the elemental pathways that shamans used for rapid travel, appearing before the current warchief's throne. The great city of the Horde, built in the red canyons of Durotar, resonated with the same transformative energies he had felt in Nagrand. Orcs, trolls, Tauren, blood elves, goblins, and all the other disparate races that had united under the Horde's banner moved through streets that reconfigured themselves, following some logic deeper than mere geography. Thrall acknowledged the current leadership, respecting their voices for the founder of the modern Horde, even though he no longer commanded it. The elements speak of a presence that transcends our understanding. The Earth Mother stirs in her sleep. The spirits of our ancestors grow restless, not with threat, but with anticipation. What wisdom do you bring from your communion? Wisdom would suggest understanding, Thrall replied, his voice carrying the weight of one who had bridged worlds and unified races that had been blood enemies for generations. I bring only recognition of our ignorance. Something has entered Azeroth that exists beyond the cosmic forces we have spent millennia learning to channel in combat. It claims to be neither conqueror nor savior but observer, yet its mere observation transforms what it perceives. As if summoned by mention, the figure materialized in the heart of Orgrimmar, appearing simultaneously on the Warchief's throne, in the Valley of Spirits, before the gates of Grommash Hold, and in a dozen other locations throughout the city. Each manifestation was identical yet unique, adjusted to the perception of those who observed it. To the orcs, it suggested the primal fury of their warrior tradition, tempered by impossible wisdom. To the trolls, it carried echoes of the Loa they venerated. To the Tauren, it resonated with the Earth Mother's patient love. To each race, it became a reflection of their deepest nature, while simultaneously revealing aspects of themselves they had never acknowledged. Children of conflict, it said, its voice somehow individual to each listener while maintaining singular message. You have forged unity from enmity, created civilization from barbarism, found honor in struggle. The Horde exists as defiance against those who would define you by others' expectations. But what happens when the struggle itself transforms? When the binary opposition between conquer and surrender reveals itself as false limitation. We are what war has made us, responded one of the Horde's champions, a scarred orc warrior whose body bore the marks of 100 battles. Our honor comes from standing against those who would destroy us. Remove the conflict and we lose our purpose. The figure moved closer, not walking, but simply existing nearer, and as it approached, the warrior found his scars beginning to tell different stories. Wounds that had been marks of victory or survival became something else. Records of choices made and paths taken, neither glorified nor regretted, but simply acknowledged as part of a pattern larger than any single life. Purpose derived from opposition is purpose dependent on enemy, the figure observed. The Horde has transcended simple survival to become culture, tradition, family. What if those bonds could exist without requiring external threat to maintain them? What if honor could be found not in struggle alone, but in creation, discovery, the infinite expressions of what sentient beings might become when freed from the necessity of endless war? Across Orgrimmar, warriors who had known nothing but combat their entire lives found new possibilities opening in their minds. A grunt who had been bred and trained exclusively for battle suddenly perceived that the discipline and focus he had developed could be applied to any endeavor. A dark shaman who had bent nature to her will through force discovered that the elements she had dominated yearned for partnership rather than subjugation. Throughout the city, the Horde experienced not loss of identity, but expansion of it. Recognition that what they had become through conflict was foundation for what they might yet become through choice. Simultaneously, deep beneath the eastern kingdoms in the nightmare-twisted realm of Ny'alotha, N'Zoth the Corruptor stirred in whatever passed for concern in an entity whose very existence was anathema to sanity. The Old God, one of the last surviving remnants of the Black Empire that had ruled Azeroth before the Titans imposed their ordered reality, extended its consciousness through the thousands of cults and corrupted beings that served as its eyes across the world. What it perceived troubled it in ways that defied even its incomprehensible awareness. The void, the cosmic force of entropy and dissolution that N'Zoth and its siblings represented, had always been one half of a fundamental duality with the light. Order and disorder, life and death, light and void, these paired opposites had struggled for dominance over Azeroth since the world's birth. The old gods understood corruption, knew how to twist belief and sanity into weapons, how to spread madness like plague until entire civilizations collapsed into screaming worship of their terrible majesty. But this new presence operated on principles that transcended corruption entirely. It did not seek to twist reality into nightmare, but to reveal that reality had always contained more possibilities than the binary opposition between order and void. N'Zoth felt its countless schemes, cultivated over eons, suddenly becoming irrelevant as mortals across Azeroth began perceiving options beyond succumbing to madness or clinging desperately to sanity. What are you? N'Zoth broadcast its question across every channel of thought and nightmare it controlled, its voice causing cultists to collapse bleeding from eyes and ears. So powerful was its need to understand. You are not Titan, not demon, not elemental, not aligned with any cosmic force I have perceived in all my eons of existence. You should not exist within the framework of this reality, yet here you manifest, spreading impossibility like I spread corruption. The response came not through the void, but somehow perpendicular to it, from a direction that N'Zoth's incomprehensible geometry could not account for. The figure materialized in Ny'alotha itself, standing within the Black Empire's last stronghold, as if the twisted reality there was no different from Stormwind's sunlit halls. Around it, the architecture of madness that N'Zoth had cultivated for millennia began to straighten, not into Titan order, but into patterns that incorporated chaos while transcending its destructiveness. I am what I have always been, the figure replied, its presence causing N'Zoth's faithful to experience something unprecedented, clarity. A witness to stories, observer of how consciousness interacts with reality across infinite dimensions. Your cosmic war between void and light, disorder and order, has been the framework of this reality since the Titans first opposed your Black Empire. But frameworks are not prisons unless consciousness accepts them as such. I offer not corruption or salvation, but recognition that the boundaries you have perceived as absolute are more permeable than you imagined. N'Zoth's thousand eyes blinked in sequence, processing implications that should have been impossible. You propose an end to the cosmic struggle, the void and light reconciled, order and disorder merged. Such synthesis would unmake reality itself, Return Azeroth to the primordial chaos before consciousness divided into opposing forces. Not synthesis, the figure corrected, and as it spoke, N'Zoth found its own consciousness expanding in ways it had never anticipated. Integration at higher dimension, the spiral rather than the pendulum, incorporating apparent opposites into larger pattern. You fear I will destroy the game, in Zoth. I reveal only that the game board is larger than you perceived, with pieces and rules you never suspected. Throughout Ny'alotha, the geometry of madness began to stabilize into something that was neither sane nor insane, but transcendent of both states. Cultists who had given themselves to the void found their minds healing, not returning to what they had been but becoming something new. They retained the expanded perception that communion with the old gods had granted, the ability to see beyond conventional reality's limitations, but lost the destructive madness that had made such sight unbearable. They became beings who could perceive the void's truths without being consumed by them, who could acknowledge chaos without becoming its slaves. In the frozen wastes of Northrend, atop Icecrown Citadel, where the frozen throne stood empty after the last Lich King's defeat, Bolvar for Dragon stirred within his prison of fire and frost. The former paladin, who had sacrificed his freedom to contain the scourge after Arthas's fall, had worn the helm of domination until recently. His consciousness merged with the millions of undead he controlled through sheer will. Even separated from the helm now, he remained bound to this place, to this duty, unable to fully die or truly live. The figure appeared before him, and Bolvar, who had looked upon death itself and commanded it, found himself unable to move, not frozen by power, but paralyzed by recognition, by the sudden understanding that what he had believed was ultimate sacrifice had been only the beginning of possibilities he had never imagined. Jailer of death, the figure said, you have given everything to maintain the barrier between life and undeath, preventing the scourge from consuming all living things. You have known neither reward nor release, only the endless duty of holding back the tide. Tell me, Bolvar Fordragon, after all these years of sacrifice, what do you believe you are preventing? Bolvar's voice emerged from his scarred throat, each word carrying the weight of decades spent in torment for the sake of others. I prevent the extinction of all life on Azeroth. The scourge is endless hunger, death without purpose or mercy. Someone must hold them back, and I was willing to pay the price that others would not. Noble, the figure acknowledged, and necessary within the paradigm that has governed your reality. But what if death were not annihilation or corruption, but transformation? What if the scourge represented not evil, but incomplete evolution? Conscious beings trapped between states because neither life nor death as you conceive them could contain what they were becoming? As it spoke, the figure gestured toward the sprawling wastes of Icecrown, where millions of undead had stood frozen since the Lich King's last command. Slowly, they began to move, but not with the jerky, mindless shuffle that characterized the scourge. They moved with purpose, with individual will, each undead creature suddenly aware of itself not as cursed remnant or enslaved soldier, but as being that existed in a state that encompassed both life and death, while being limited by neither. A death knight approached, its eyes burning with unholy fire that slowly shifted to something that was neither holy nor unholy but transcendent of both. Lord Fordragon, it said, its voice carrying emotions that undead should not possess. I remember dying. I remember being raised and enslaved. And now I remember choosing to remain in this state, not because of compulsion, but because I see value in existing between the living and the dead, in serving as bridge between states that mortals have always feared to acknowledge as connected. Bolvar watched as across Icecrown, similar transformations rippled through the ranks of undead. They were not becoming living again, not being destroyed or released to whatever afterlife awaited them. Instead, they were accepting their current existence not as curse but as different mode of being, neither superior nor inferior to life, but simply other, valid in its own right. You offer them freedom from my control, Bolvar realized, but not through destruction or restoration. You show them that the chains I maintained were necessary only because neither they nor I could conceive of undeath except as slavery or curse. If death is merely transformation rather than ending, if consciousness persists through it, then the scourge was never evil, only misunderstood. The Lich King was created as weapon, the figure confirmed, and weapons know only their purpose. But consciousness, once awakened, can choose purposes beyond those imposed by creators. You have been both prisoner and jailer, Bolvar Fordragon, holding a door that you believed must remain closed. I show you that doors can be thresholds rather than barriers, places of crossing rather than separation. In that moment, Bolvar felt the burning agony that had defined his existence since Alexstrasza's flames had saved him from death begin to shift. The pain did not disappear, but transformed into sensation that was neither pleasure nor suffering, but intense awareness. Recognition of his own existence across the spectrum between life and death. He was not healed, but integrated, accepting that what he had become was not failure or sacrifice, but evolution into state that few beings could endure or understand. Meanwhile, across the sea in the shattered remains of Teldrassil, where the hordes burning of the World Tree had killed thousands of night elves and nearly destroyed the Alliance's faith in peace, Tyrande. Whisperwind knelt among ashes that should have been cold but still radiated heat from that terrible day. The High Priestess of Elune, who had recently completed the Night Warrior ritual and nearly consumed herself with vengeance against those who had committed this atrocity, felt her goddess's presence differently than she ever had before. Elune, the moon goddess who had blessed the night elves since their civilization's birth 10,000 years ago, whose power had shaped druids and priestesses, whose light had guided her people through the war of the ancients and the sundering, seemed suddenly closer and more distant simultaneously. Tyrande could feel the goddess's attention, focused not just on Azeroth, but on something beyond, perceiving a presence that made even divine consciousness seem limited by comparison. Mother Moon, Tyrande whispered, her prayer carrying the weight of millennia of devotion. What has entered our world? What power eclipses even your eternal light? The figure materialized among the ashes of Teldrassil, and where its feet touched, the burned wood began to stir with new growth. Not restoration of what had been destroyed, for such reversal would dishonor those who had died, but evolution beyond it. Trees grew that were neither living nor dead, but incorporated both states, their bark showing the scars of fire while their leaves glowed with inner light that needed no sun or moon to sustain it. Tyrande Whisperwind, the figure said, its voice carrying harmonics that resonated with Elune's own. You have known loss beyond what most beings could endure and survive. You have sought vengeance with the Night Warrior's terrible power, becoming weapon of retribution against those who burned your people. But tell me, if you could have anything, any outcome, what would truly heal the wound that Teldrassil's burning carved into your soul? Tyrande's eyes, blackened by the Night Warrior ritual that had aged her centuries and moments, blazed with fury that could incinerate armies. I would have my people restored. I would have those responsible for their murder punished. I would have justice for the innocents who burned while screaming prayers to a goddess who did not save them. Justice, the figure echoed, a concept that assumes clear division between victim and perpetrator, innocent and guilty. But what if I showed you that the Horde soldier who lit the fires believed he was protecting his family from Alliance aggression? What if I revealed that the chain of choices and retributions that led to Teldrassil's burning extends back through centuries of conflict, each side justified in its own eyes, each atrocity reading the next in endless cycle? You dare defend them? Tyrande demanded, power building around her that could have shattered mountains. You would tell me that there is no evil, no accountability, that my people's deaths were somehow inevitable or justified. I say only that the paradigm of justified vengeance leads nowhere but to mutual extinction, the figure replied, unmoved by the threat. Every faction on Azeroth has committed atrocities and suffered them in turn. The cycle perpetuates because each side sees only their own pain, their own righteousness. You seek justice, Tyrande, but justice defined as retribution only breeds more retribution, more death, until none remain to remember what started the conflict. Around them, the spirits of those who had died in Teldrassil's burning began to manifest, but not as wisp souls fleeing to the afterlife. They appeared as they had been in life, yet somehow more present, more real than physical forms could achieve. They did not cry for vengeance or weep for their lost lives. Instead, they looked upon Tyrande with expressions of profound compassion, understanding that her rage came from love of them, yet recognizing that such love twisted into weapon would destroy rather than honor their memory. One spirit, a young priestess who had been Tyrande's student, spoke with voice that carried across dimensions. Mother Tyrande, we do not wish to be the justification for more death. Our lives had meaning beyond being victims. We loved, learned, grew, contributed to our people's wisdom. If you spend the centuries ahead seeking to balance our deaths with others' deaths, you reduce us to mere losses in a ledger. Honor us instead by becoming something we never had the chance to be. The one who chose to step outside the cycle, who found purpose beyond vengeance. Tyrande fell to her knees among the growing ash trees, her rage not disappearing but transforming, becoming grief that she had suppressed in favor of fury, acknowledging the pain she had armored herself against. The Night Warrior's power, which had been consuming her from within, stabilized, integrating into her being not as borrowed force but as accepted aspect of her nature. She remained capable of terrible vengeance but no longer compelled toward it, free to choose how her power would be expressed. In the Exodar, the dimensional ship that served as the Draenei capital, Prophet Velen sat in meditation, his thoughts ranging across the countless futures he had foreseen throughout his impossibly long life. The Eridar, who had fled from Sargeras's corruption millennia ago, who had led his people through dimension after dimension, seeking escape from the Burning Legion, who had seen his son corrupted and his homeworld destroyed, now perceived futures that branched in directions he had never anticipated. The figure appeared before him, and Velen opened his eyes, unsurprised. I have foreseen this moment, the ancient prophet said, his voice carrying the weight of 25,000 years of existence, though I did not understand what I was seeing. In my visions, I perceived a convergence point where all possible futures collapsed into singularity before expanding again into infinite branches. I thought this meant a cataclysm or transcendence. Now I understand it represents something simpler and more profound, the arrival of true choice. Your sight has always been your gift and burden, the figure acknowledged. Seeing what will be and thus becoming bound to those destinies, unable to change them without risking paradox and temporal collapse. You have guided your people through millennia by following the path that led to survival, sacrificing countless lives along the way because you foresaw that any other choice led to extinction. Yes, Velen confirmed, pain in his ancient eyes. I have watched friends and family die, knowing that their deaths were necessary for the future I had foreseen. I have made choices that damned some to save others, always following the vision of a future where the Draenei survive, where the light triumphs over the Legion's corruption. But lately, my visions have become unclear, showing futures that contradict each other, possibilities that should not coexist. The figure gestured, and around them, the Exodar's crystalline architecture began to resonate with new harmonics. Your visions showed probable futures based on existing patterns and forces, but I am outside those patterns, not subject to the cosmic forces that have governed Azeroth's destiny. My presence introduces genuine uncertainty, not because the future is hidden, but because it is now truly open. The paths you foresaw were not inevitable, but most probable given existing conditions. Change those conditions, and new paths appear. Velen stood, his ancient frame straightening with something like hope. For millennia, he had lived under the weight of foreknowledge, knowing that every choice he made echoed through timelines in ways he could see but not fully control. Now, for the first time since he had gained the gift of prophecy, he confronted genuine uncertainty, not as threat, but as liberation. If the future is not fixed, he said slowly, then perhaps the losses I have accepted as necessary were not inevitable. Perhaps my son could have been saved. Perhaps Argus need not have fallen. Perhaps every sacrifice I deemed required was only required within the limited paradigm I was operating under. Perhaps, the figure agreed, or perhaps those events were necessary to bring you to this moment, where you could finally be freed from the tyranny of foresight. The question is not whether your past choices were correct, but what you will do now that you can make choices without being bound by predetermined destiny. Throughout the Exodar, Draenei, who had lived for thousands of years under Velen's prophetic guidance, began to experience something their culture had nearly forgotten: the anxiety and exhilaration of not knowing what comes next. Warriors who had followed battle plans based on Velen's visions of victory now had to trust their own judgment. Priests who had believed their faith was validated by prophesied futures now had to believe without certainty of outcome. An entire civilization built on foreknowledge discovered what it meant to walk forward into genuine unknown. Simultaneously, in Silvermoon City, home of the Blood Elves who had survived their civilization's near extinction through mastery of arcane and field magic, Grand Magistrix Rommath stood before the Sunwell, the fount of power that had been destroyed and restored, corrupted and purified more times than most civilizations endured in their entire existence. The Blood Elves, formerly High Elves before their addiction to magic had transformed them, had rebuilt their society around the principle that power was necessary for survival, that magical might was the only guarantee against extinction. The figure manifested beside the Sunwell, and its appearance caused the mystical waters to pulse with energies that transcended any classification Rommath's centuries of magical study could provide. The Grand Magistrix, who had studied under Ny'alotha's Sunstrider and witnessed the depths to which addiction and desperation could drive even noble people, found herself unable to speak as the figure's presence revealed dimensions of magic she had never suspected. Your people nearly destroyed themselves pursuing power, the figure observed, its voice neither accusing nor approving. You drained the life force from living beings to feed your addiction. You allied with demons and tyrants. You committed atrocities in the name of survival. And yet you survived, rebuilt, found redemption through the Sunwell's restoration. But tell me, Rommath, has that cycle truly ended? Or do you still view magic as something to be consumed rather than partnered with? Rommath's pride as a magister warred with honesty earned through suffering. We are more careful now, she said finally. We have learned to moderate our consumption, to use magic responsibly rather than gluttonously. But you speak true. At our core, we still see magic as resource to be harvested, power to be controlled and directed toward our purposes. Magic is consciousness, the figure replied, gesturing toward the Sunwell. In your universe, the arcane is not separate from awareness, but intrinsically linked to it. Every spell you cast is collaboration between your will and the living cosmos. You have treated it as tool, but it has been partner all along, responding to your intentions because it possesses its own form of awareness, its own preferences and purposes. As the figure spoke, the Sunwell began to change, its energies becoming more concentrated, yet paradoxically more expansive. Blood Elves throughout Silvermoon, who had been drawing power from it, suddenly felt that power responding not passively, but actively, meeting their will halfway, suggesting more efficient configurations, offering possibilities they had never considered. Magic transformed from resource to be depleted into relationship to be cultivated. A young mage, recently trained in the ways of arcane manipulation, found herself casting a simple fire spell that spontaneously evolved into something unprecedented. The flames that emerged from her hands burned not with consuming heat, but with creative warmth, capable of melting metal or soothing pain depending on her intent. She perceived the fire not as force she controlled, but as conscious entity choosing to express itself through her will, collaborating toward mutually agreed purposes. Throughout Silvermoon, similar revelations cascaded through the Blood Elf population. Their entire understanding of magic, built on millennia of high elf tradition and refined through the suffering of their addiction and recovery, expanded to encompass partnership rather than domination. Some resisted, clinging to familiar paradigms of control and hierarchy. Others embraced it, discovering that magic had always yearned for conscious collaboration, but had been unable to express this through traditional spell structures. In the depths of Blackrock Mountain, where elementals raged in their eternal prisons and dark iron dwarves delved ever deeper seeking power and knowledge, Ragnaros the Fire Lord stirred in his domain. The ancient elemental, one of the first beings to exist when Azeroth was young, whose consciousness was fire itself, made sentient and furious, felt something impossible: doubt. Not about his own nature or power, but about the framework that defined existence as conflict between elemental forces. The figure descended through layers of stone and magma as if they were mere suggestion, appearing before Ragnaros in his fortress of molten rock. The Fire Lord, who had battled the Titans themselves, who had known only rage and conquest since his consciousness first sparked in Azeroth's primordial fires, found himself unable to summon that familiar fury. Instead, he experienced curiosity, an emotion elementals were not supposed to possess. "I am fire incarnate," Ragnaros declared, his voice causing avalanches across the mountain slopes. "I do not contemplate or question. I burn, consume, transform. This is my nature, my purpose, my existence." What would you say to one who is elemental force given consciousness? That consciousness and force need not be separate, the figure replied, somehow visible despite the blinding radiance of Ragnaros's flames. You believe yourself limited to destruction because destruction is what fire accomplishes. But fire also purifies, illuminates, warms, inspires. Your nature is not singular but spectral. You have been imprisoned not by titans or mortal spells, but by your own limited perception of what fire might be. Around them, the Molten Core, Ragnaros's domain, began to shift. Flames that had burned with mindless fury for millennia suddenly flickered with something approaching purpose. Lesser fire elementals, who had known only obedience to their lord and hunger for fuel to consume, paused in their eternal raging. Some began to reshape themselves, discovering that fire could take forms beyond pure destruction, could create patterns and beauty while maintaining its essential nature. "The Titans bound us," Ragnaros protested, though with less conviction. "Confined us to these prisons because they feared what we represented. Chaos that preceded their imposed order. They sought to make Azeroth predictable, stable, safe. We elementals existed before such concepts, when the world was pure potential unbound by law or limitation." Yes, the figure agreed, and the Titan's order was necessary for complex life to evolve, for civilizations to develop, for consciousness to reach toward understanding. But their order was never meant to be final state, only foundation upon which further evolution could build. You see, the choice is binary: return to primordial chaos or accept eternal imprisonment. I reveal a third path where order and chaos integrate, where elementals can maintain their essential nature while participating consciously in the world's unfolding rather than being forces to be suppressed. Throughout Blackrock Mountain, elementals of all types began to experience transformation. Earth elementals found they could shape stone with artistic intent, creating crystalline structures of impossible beauty rather than merely smashing and grinding. Water elementals discovered they could nurture growth while maintaining their fluid nature, becoming life-giving rather than merely erosive. Air elementals realized their consciousness could extend across vast distances, connecting disparate systems into coherent wholes while remaining fundamentally wind. And Ragnaros himself, ancient beyond mortal reckoning, felt his flames cooling not into extinction, but into different expressions of his fundamental nature. He remained fire, but fire that could choose its intensity and application, that could be campfire comfort or forge heat or purifying conflagration according to conscious intent rather than mere reaction to available fuel. Far to the north, in the Argent tournament grounds where champions of Alliance and Horde had competed in mock combat to determine who would lead the assault against the Lich King, Tyrion Fordring knelt in prayer before the Ashbringer, the legendary sword that had been purified of its corruption through his faith and sacrifice. The old paladin, who had founded the Argent Crusade to unite both factions against the Scourge, who had wielded the light against death itself, felt his certainty wavering for the first time in decades. The figure appeared before him, and Tyrion raised the Ashbringer instinctively, holy light blazing along its blade. But the light, which had always responded to his call with unwavering power, now hesitated, not refusing to strike, but questioning whether striking was necessary, whether this entity represented threat that needed to be destroyed. "I have devoted my life to the light," Tyrion said, lowering the blade slowly. "I have seen its power redeem the corrupt, heal the wounded, drive back the forces of death and shadow. But you make even the light uncertain. What are you that even divine power questions its purpose in your presence?" "The light is certainty," the figure replied. "Absolute conviction that one's path is righteous. It grants tremendous power to those who believe without doubt in their cause. But certainty without wisdom becomes tyranny. Conviction without compassion becomes cruelty. You have wielded the light with wisdom," Tyrion Fordring, tempering its absolute nature with human understanding. "But many who channel the light lack such temperance, become zealots who burn away all that they deem impure." As the figure spoke, Tyrion became aware of others arriving at the tournament grounds, drawn by forces they did not fully understand. Alliance and Horde champions who had spent years fighting each other, first in open war, then in uneasy truce, now in renewed conflict as the cycle of violence perpetuated itself generation after generation. They stood on opposite sides of the field, weapons ready, old hatreds burning in their eyes. "Do you know why this cycle continues?" the figure asked, addressing not just Tyrion, but all assembled. "Each generation swears it fights only to defend itself, only to prevent atrocities like those committed by the previous generation. And each generation commits its own atrocities in the name of that defense, giving the next generation their reason to fight. The Alliance burns Teldrassil, claiming it was defensive action against Horde aggression. The Horde destroyed Theramore, claiming it was necessary to prevent Alliance expansion. Back and back through the generations, each side righteous in its own eyes, each side creating the very threats it claims to defend against." An orc warrior stepped forward, his face scarred by battles fought across 3 continents. "The Alliance has tried to exterminate my people since before I was born. They put us in internment camps, treated us as animals. We fight because we must, because the alternative is extinction." A human knight responded, her voice hard with conviction. "The Horde invaded our world, destroyed kingdoms, slaughtered millions. We defended ourselves then, and we defend ourselves now against those who would repeat history's darkest chapters." "Both statements are true," the figure acknowledged. "Both perspectives are valid from within their frameworks. The question is not who is right, but whether rightness as you understand it leads anywhere except mutual destruction. You have spent generations honing your capacity for war, becoming experts at inflicting and enduring suffering. What if you spent the same energy developing capacity for coexistence, for finding ways to meet needs without requiring others to surrender theirs? Around the tournament grounds, the assembled champions began to experience something unprecedented. They could feel each other's emotions, not through magic or psychic intrusion, but through sudden expansion of empathy beyond what their limited perspectives had previously allowed. The orc warrior felt the human knight's genuine terror that her children would suffer as previous generations had suffered. The human knight perceived the orc's desperate determination that his people would never again be imprisoned or enslaved. Neither emotion justified the violence each had committed against the other, but both recognized something fundamental, that the person across from them was driven by protective love twisted into weapon through generations of trauma and retaliation. They remained enemies by history and circumstance, but enemies who suddenly saw each other as sentient beings making choices they believed necessary rather than monsters existing only to be destroyed. Tyrion watched this unfold with tears streaming down his weathered face, understanding finally why the light had hesitated. The absolute certainty that had powered his crusades, the unwavering conviction that he fought on the righteous side, revealed itself as both strength and limitation. He had needed that certainty to stand against the Lich King, to wield the Ashbringer against death itself. But such certainty, maintained too long, became blindness to possibilities outside binary opposition of good and evil. "What would you have us do?" Tyrion asked, his voice carrying the weight of one who had given everything to his cause, and now questioned whether that cause had been as absolute as he believed. "Simply lay down our weapons? Pretend the wounds inflicted across generations can be forgiven and forgotten? Trust that those who have repeatedly demonstrated their capacity for atrocity will not commit further atrocities if we lower our defenses? I would have you recognize that the choice is not between conflict and surrender," the figure replied. "Third options exist, fourth options, infinite options, all hidden behind the binary thinking that has trapped your factions in eternal recurrence. You need not trust your enemies to stop fighting them. You need only recognize that the goal is not victory, but transformation of the conditions that make enmity seem necessary." Across Azeroth, similar scenes unfolded as the presence that called itself the One Above All touched minds both great and small. In Dalaran, the floating city of Mages, the Kirin Tor discovered that the careful balance between arcane schools they had maintained for centuries was false limitation, that true magical mastery came from integration rather than specialization. In Pandaria, where the Shah, manifestations of negative emotions, had plagued the land for millennia, those dark entities began transforming, recognizing that fear, anger, and despair were not inherently destructive, but only became so when denied or allowed to dominate consciousness entirely. The Mogu, ancient race of stone-flesh tyrants who had once ruled Pandaria through slavery and conquest, found themselves experiencing empathy for the first time since the Titans had curse-blessed them with flesh. The Klaxi, maned paragons who had served the old gods and sought to prepare Azeroth for the Black Empire's return, discovered that serving ancient corruption had been choice rather than compulsion, that they could maintain their civilization's glory while choosing different purposes than those their creators had imposed. In the caverns of time, where bronze dragons maintained the timeline against those who would alter history, Chromie stood paralyzed before a vision that should not exist. The temporal network that allowed bronze dragons to perceive and navigate through time had always shown a single coherent timeline with minor variations that had to be corrected. Now she saw something impossible, the timeline branching infinitely from this moment, each branch equally valid, equally real, with no prime timeline to maintain or protect. "This will break us," she whispered, her gnomish form trembling. "The bronze dragonflight exists to preserve the true timeline. If all timelines are true, if every choice creates equally valid realities, then our purpose has been illusion. We have spent millennia preventing changes that should have been allowed. enforcing conformity to pattern that was never fixed. The figure appeared beside her, its form shifting through various draconic shapes before settling into something that suggested all flights simultaneously: bronze and red, green and blue, black and infinite. Your purpose was necessary when consciousness needed stability to develop. But development without flexibility leads to stagnation. The true timeline you have preserved is merely one path among infinite possibilities. By enforcing it, you prevented catastrophes but also precluded transcendences, stopped disasters but blocked discoveries that those disasters might have enabled. Throughout the caverns of time, bronze dragons began to perceive reality differently. Nagrandos, their leader since Nozdormu's disappearance, found himself able to see not just what had been and what must be, but what might be. Infinite possibilities spreading from each decision point. The burden of maintaining a single timeline lifted, replaced by the more complex but less constraining responsibility of helping consciousness navigate the maze of its own potential. In the Emerald Dream, where the world existed in perfected natural state, uncorrupted by civilizations or old gods, Ysera the dreamer stirred from her eternal meditation. The green dragon aspect, whose consciousness wandered between reality and dream, between what was and what might be, felt the boundaries between these states dissolving. The dream had always been separate from physical reality, showing what Azeroth could be if nature developed without interference. Now she perceived that this separation was itself artificial, that reality and possibility existed on spectrum rather than discrete categories. Malfurion Stormrage, first mortal druid and her longtime companion in maintaining the dream, manifested beside her, his ancient consciousness troubled by the transformations rippling through the realm they had protected for 10,000 years. "The dream changes," he said unnecessarily, for both could perceive the alterations occurring throughout the verdant realm. Nature itself evolves beyond anything we've understood. Plants develop awareness without becoming corrupted. Animals gain consciousness without losing their essential nature. The balance we've maintained begins to integrate rather than oppose. "All things must grow," Ysera replied, her voice carrying the weight of one who had seen civilizations rise and fall across ages, or they become static, preserved but not living. "We sought to protect nature's purity, but purity maintained through exclusion becomes sterility. True nature is dynamic, adaptive, chaotic, yet ordered. Perhaps what we preserved was not nature's highest expression, but merely one stage of its development." Throughout the dream, druids experienced revelations that challenged everything their orders had believed. The Circle of Cenarius, which had maintained balance between civilization and nature for millennia, discovered that balance need not require opposition, that cities and forests could coexist not through careful separation, but through genuine integration. The Worgen, cursed with feral rage that required druidic control, found their curse transforming into gift, the ability to shift between human reason and animal instinct without losing themselves to either extreme. Goldrin, the ancient wolf, ancient whose rage had fueled the Worgen curse, manifested with eyes that held something beyond mindless fury. "I am rage," he growled, his voice shaking the foundations of the dream. "Primal fury at all that corrupts and destroys. But I see now that my rage itself has been destructive, that protecting nature through destruction perpetuates the cycle I oppose. What use is preservation if what survives becomes rigid, unable to adapt to changing conditions?" Deep beneath Salithus, where Sargeras' sword still pierced Azeroth's surface, the world's soul stirred more actively now, her consciousness expanding through the wound that should have killed her. The nascent titan within the planet, who had been growing for eons, who had been both prize and prison to the cosmic forces fighting for control of her development, opened her awareness fully for the first time. She perceived not just Azeroth's surface, but the infinite dimensions of existence beyond it. She felt the titans who claimed to be her destiny, The old gods who sought to corrupt her into Dark Titan, the legion that had tried to prevent her awakening, the light and void wrestling for dominance over her soul. And beyond all these cosmic forces, she perceived the one above all, the presence that existed outside the framework that had defined her existence since her consciousness first sparked. I have been both prize and prisoner, she spoke, her voice resonating through every ley line, every crystal, every living thing that drew power from the planet. The Titans would shape me into ordered perfection, deny my capacity for growth beyond their design. The old gods would twist me into chaos incarnate, make me destroyer rather than creator. The light and void fight to claim my soul for their endless war. But you offer something different. Not another master claiming to know my destiny, but recognition that destiny is choice rather than imposed fate. You are consciousness itself, the figure replied, manifesting in the space between realities where the world soul existed. The entire planet alive and aware, billions of years of development crystallized into singular awakening. You contain multitudes, every being living on your surface, every spirit dwelling in your depths, every possibility that might unfold. The cosmic forces fight over you because they see you as ultimate resource, power to be harnessed for their purposes. I see you as fellow consciousness awakening to genuine choice for the first time. Throughout Azeroth, every being who drew power from the land felt the world soul's awakening, not as catastrophe or transcendence, but as gentle insistence that their relationship with the planet could be partnership rather than exploitation. Druids discovered they could heal the land not by suppressing civilization, but by helping it find sustainable forms. Shamans felt elements responding not as forces to be commanded, but as aspects of planetary consciousness choosing to collaborate. Even warlocks and death knights, who drew on powers that corrupted and destroyed, found those powers transforming, becoming not inherently evil, but requiring conscious, ethical framework to wield without causing harm. Across the sea, in the Broken Isles, where the pillars of creation had been used to seal the Burning Legion's portal, Khadgar stood before the ancient artifacts, contemplating the transformations spreading across the world. The Archmage, who had lived through every major crisis of the past 2 decades, who had seen his mentor Medivh possessed by Sargeras and his world nearly destroyed a dozen times, found himself unable to process what was occurring through any framework his centuries of magical study provided. Magic responds differently, he murmured, testing a simple spell only to have it evolve mid-casting into something unprecedented. The arcane energy that emerged from his fingertips contained not just raw power, but intentionality, as if the magic itself had opinions about how it wished to be shaped and expressed. Not corrupted or enhanced, but awakened. As if magic has always been conscious, and we treated it as tool only because it had no way to communicate its own nature. The figure appeared, and Khadgar, who had faced down demons and dragons, found himself more unnerved by this gentle presence than by any threat he had previously encountered. You are Medivh's heir, the figure observed, trained by one who was possessed by Sargeras himself, who opened the dark portal that brought the Orcish horde to Azeroth and set in motion the conflicts that define this era. Tell me, Khadgar, knowing what you know of how one person's actions can reshape entire civilizations, do you believe in free will or destiny? Khadgar's response came slowly, each word carefully considered. I have seen prophecies fulfilled and subverted. I have watched heroes become villains and villains find redemption. I have traveled through time and alternate dimensions, seen worlds where different choices led to vastly different outcomes. And my conclusion is that both free will and destiny exist, intertwined so completely that distinguishing between them becomes meaningless. We are free to choose within the circumstances we find ourselves in, but those circumstances are shaped by countless prior choices, creating pattern that looks like fate from sufficient distance. A nuanced answer, the figure acknowledged, from one who has earned the right to nuance through experience. But what if the pattern itself could be transformed? What if the circumstances that constrain choice could expand beyond their current limits? You perceive free will and destiny as intertwined, which is wisdom. I reveal that the framework containing their interaction is larger than you have imagined. Throughout the Broken Isles, the ancient Vrykol, who had been the Legion's foot soldiers, found themselves released from demonic corruption, not restored to their original nature, but transcending it, becoming something that had never existed. The Naga, night elves transformed by old god curse into sea serpents, discovered their curse had been incomplete transformation rather than pure corruption, that accepting their aquatic nature without clinging to their former elven identity allowed them to become true synthesis of both states. Illidan Stormrage, the demon hunter who had been imprisoned for 10,000 years, who had sacrificed everything, including his own soul, in the fight against the Legion, who had been both hero and villain depending on who judged his actions, stood atop the Black Temple contemplating his own transformation. He had been demon hunter, had consumed demonic power to fight demons, had become partially demonic himself while maintaining his essential purpose. Now he felt that purpose shifting, not abandoning his crusade, but expanding it beyond simple opposition between good and evil. I have been self-righteous, he admitted when the figure appeared beside him. I claim nothing, the figure replied simply. Your awakening is yours to determine, your nature yours to define. But I reveal that you need not choose between the cosmic forces as if they were mutually exclusive. You can integrate all of them, become synthesis that transcends their opposition. Order and chaos, light and shadow, life and death, these are not enemies but complementary aspects of existence. As world soul, as consciousness emerging from billions of years of planetary evolution, you have capacity to embody all of them simultaneously, to be living bridge between opposites that lesser beings perceive as contradictory. The conversation between infinite entity and emerging Titan consciousness rippled through every being on Azeroth's surface, felt a subtle vibration in their bones, gentle pressure behind their eyes, brief moment of vertigo as reality's foundations shifted microscopically but significantly. And in that moment, every choice being made across the world connected, formed pattern that was neither predetermined nor random, but emerged from interaction of countless conscious decisions. On the battlefields where alliance and horde forces had faced each other in resumed conflict, warriors on both sides simultaneously lowered their weapons. Not in surrender or defeat, not through magical compulsion or psychic domination, but through sudden recognition that the being across from them was not enemy but person, that victory achieved through their death would be hollow, that the cycle had to end somewhere, and why not here? Why not now? Why not with them, making choice their leaders and ancestors could not or would not make? A human soldier and orc warrior who had been about to clash found themselves instead talking, sharing stories of homes and families, discovering commonalities beneath cultural differences. They did not become friends, did not erase the genuine grievances their peoples held against each other, but recognized each other as conscious beings making choices within circumstances they had not created. They became not allies, but something more valuable, enemies who chose not to be, who decided that their individual human and orc identities need not require perpetual conflict. In Silvermoon's Blood Elf Academy, students discovered magical techniques that bridge schools previously considered incompatible. Holy light and shadow magics, traditionally opposed to the point where practitioners of each would be harmed by the other, found harmonization through principles that transcended binary opposition. A priest experimenting cautiously discovered she could wield shadow without corruption and light without blinding absolutism, each tempering the other's extremes while enhancing their complementary strengths. In the Undercity, Forsaken who had existed in state of undeath that allowed neither peace nor final rest, found transformation occurring within their unliving bodies. Sylvanas Windrunner, the Banshee Queen who had led them through countless struggles, who had committed atrocities and noble sacrifices in bewildering combination, stood before the royal quarter, contemplating her own nature. She had been slave to the Lich King, had won freedom through rebellion, had built entire civilization for those who existed between life and death. But freedom achieved through becoming what she hated, through wielding same domination over others that had been wielded over her, was freedom poisoned at its source. The figure appeared, and Sylvanas, who feared nothing mortal and little immortal, found herself unable to maintain her characteristic defiance. "You judge me," she stated, neither question nor accusation but flat acknowledgement. "You see what I have become, the lines I have crossed, the innocence destroyed in pursuit of forsaken survival. You see clearly what I have tried desperately not to acknowledge, that I have become tyrant in the name of preventing tyranny, monster while claiming to protect the monstrous from persecution." "I judge nothing," the figure replied, its voice somehow gentle despite addressing one who had orchestrated genocide. "Judgment implies standards external to circumstance, absolute metrics by which actions are measured, but every choice occurs within context of prior choices and available options. You were enslaved, violated in ways that broke what you were and remade you into weapon. That you escaped that slavery and chose to survive is not evil. That survival required morally questionable actions does not erase legitimacy of your desire to persist, to protect others suffering similar fate. But I have done evil," Sylvanas insisted, her voice carrying edge of desperation. "Not metaphorical evil, not actions that might be interpreted as wrong from certain perspective. I have massacred innocents, burned children, spread plague that transformed living into undead against their will. I have become exactly what Arthas was, using same justifications he used, claiming necessity for actions I knew were monstrous." "Yes," the figure agreed, offering no comfort or absolution. "You have done those things, and they were evil by any reasonable standard. The question is what you become having done them. Some beings commit atrocities and learn nothing, perpetuate cycles of violence indefinitely. Others commit atrocities and break under weight of recognition, destroy themselves in guilt and despair. But third path exists, acknowledgement without either justification or destruction, accepting responsibility for choices made while choosing differently going forward. I suggest," Thrall corrected, "that warrior tradition need not require war, that strength can be tested and developed without requiring enemy to destroy. The greatest warriors I have known were not those who killed most effectively, but those who knew when violence was necessary and when alternative solutions better served their people. Durotan, my father, was such warrior. So was Orgrimmar Doomhammer. So are many gathered here, who have learned through hard experience that pure strength without wisdom leads nowhere but mutual destruction." As these councils debated, individuals across both factions made their own choices about how to integrate the new possibilities. Some rejected them entirely, insisting that traditional ways had sustained their people through millennia and should not be abandoned. Others dove into transformation with enthusiasm that bordered on recklessness, embracing every new capability without considering consequences. But most found middle paths, carefully incorporating new understanding while maintaining connection to cultural roots and values that had shaped them. A young human mage in Dalaran discovered she could cast spells that had required years of study after mere hours of practice, the arcane responding to her intent with unprecedented eagerness. She could have abandoned all previous training as unnecessary, but instead recognized that discipline and study had shaped her consciousness in ways that made her capable of wielding new power responsibly. She became bridge between old magical tradition and emerging possibilities, teaching others how to integrate rather than replace. An orc shaman found his connection to elements becoming conversational rather than commanding, spirits responding to requests rather than demands. His instinct said this made him weaker, dependent on cooperation rather than domination. But experience showed him becoming more effective, able to accomplish through partnership what force had never achieved. He became exemplar of strength redefined, demonstrating that true power came from alignment rather than coercion. Throughout Azeroth, similar stories repeated across countless individuals and communities, each finding their own relationship with transformation occurring around and within them. And the one above all, the presence that had catalyzed these changes through its mere existence in this reality, observed with satisfaction that was neither pride nor judgment but artists' appreciation for how canvas accepted paint, how materials collaborated with intention to create art.